What's the crack, everyone? It's Nathan here, aka the Rambling Kern, and head instructor of Kern School of Combat. So today's video is one that I've wanted to discuss for a while because it is a topic that I am regularly asked about, and it is one that I wanted to address because I've seen the topic brought up and discussed to varying degrees of accuracy, and it's kind of one that I wanted to explain to people because it's an interesting topic and it touches on a lot of the various areas that I tend to discuss with this channel. So the topic is basically knife fighting and knife fighting arts in Ireland and why they were or were not a thing. And the very quick summary of it is that they weren't a thing. Now there's a number of reasons why, and there's a number of reasons as to why they didn't develop and become a thing. So to start off, at one point they may have been a thing, and in secrecy they may have been a thing, but if we go back to the very early periods that I discuss and that I talk about, if we're looking at, say, the 15th, 16th century, when you had Irish people notoriously using the skean and the Irish fighting knife, very likely that these gents were trained in how to use these and had their own systems of using them. However, but due to the penal laws and the various different things that happened in Ireland, there was a complete ban on owning any sort of weapon, and especially being able to carry one. So often knife fighting arts develop in that sort of environment where people have a knife on them at all times and learn how to use it, especially if they're using it in a combat sense. So that was not something that happened in Ireland. Due to the penal laws, these weapons were outlawed and people were not allowed to carry weapons on them at all times. However, if we fast forward into the era of faction fighting, often people ask me, well, if people were using sticks and commonly using sticks in a self-defense and a fighting scenario, why were they not using knives? Because it's much easier to conceal a knife and use that than it is to use a stick. For example, even a short shillelagh like this, it's not very concealable. Maybe you could shove it up your sleeve, or if you're wearing a long coat, you could conceal it inside. However, you can have a knife in your pocket, no problem, and pull one out whenever you need to. So much more concealable, something like this that you could have in your belt or in any sort of pocket or up your sleeve. But it was not used and not carried and not used in faction fights for a number of reasons, and I think this is something that's very important for people to understand, because faction fighting was not, for the most part, just a means to just enact violence on each other. At times faction fights were feuds between different groups, but the majority of faction fighting that happened in Ireland was essentially recreational violence. And I've covered this in a video before, but often these were arranged events or they took place at fair days. Now, this is really important to understand because fair days in Ireland were like the modern day equivalent of a music festival. This is where friends, family, loved ones, everyone and the entire local community would gather together and have a day off. And this was a very rare thing at the time because you had subsistence farmers who were working all day, every day, to keep food on the table, so to get time off and enjoy themselves was a very important thing. As a result, faction fighting was kind of these organised fights that would happen at them, but more importantly, people didn't want fatalities to occur. And there's kind of a twofold reason for this. And in a previous book I mentioned on faction fighting and the liberties, it expressly discusses faction fights between the butchers and the weavers. Now these were essentially guild-like groups. These were professional working men. And they fought in kind of faction fights within the centre of Dublin. And it is expressly said a number of times that they didn't want fatalities to occur. And this was for a number of reasons. One, they didn't want the authorities to become involved. And two, they didn't want the authorities to cancel the thing they were doing. So the easiest way to avoid that was to avoid fatalities. People were very badly hurt and very badly injured, but they didn't want fatalities to occur. Now, for the likes of the Butchers Guild, they definitely had knives and cleavers and all different sort of sharp weapons on them that they used, but they didn't want to kill people, because when that did eventually happen, during these fights, the law got involved. And for those who don't really know, at the time there was a police force, but primarily when things got out of hand, the army was called in, and that's when things got very violent. And the army would get involved, and they were very quick to use deadly force. In other words, pulling rifles and just killing anyone who got out of line. So the locals really didn't want that to happen, but more importantly, they didn't want these events to be cancelled. So for faction fighting especially, we didn't see knife fighting being a thing. And then the second reason is basically because of that, you had essentially kind of an honor system where, yes, people were very badly hurt, and in some of the more extreme faction fights, many people were killed. But if you look at how many were occurring at almost every fair day, this was not something that people wanted to happen because they didn't want these events to be cancelled. For many people, this was their only day off. So as a result, they did not want these fair days to be cancelled by the authorities, or for the authorities to interject in them and potentially enact violence at them, which on a few occasions did happen. So as a result, knife use and knife fighting became something very much associated with criminals. Now, I know this is where the lines get a bit blurred for some people because often they equate faction fighters as criminals. And they look at the kind of Peaky Blinder-esque, criminals of the late 1800s, early 1900s, of which there are various different groups, and they kind of lump faction fighters in with those. And yes, there was crossover, but they were not the same thing. As a result, knife use in the media in Ireland was very much portrayed as a criminal's or a murderer's tool. And that's where you have the likes of events such as the Phoenix Park murders that really compounded that. And that is the image that I used for the thumbnail of this video. This was a murder basically that took place in Phoenix Park. That's kind of a topic of its own. But it did kind of compound that the use of knives in a violent scenario was often used by murderers or by criminals, and as a result you had a very negative opinion and negative view of those. So kind of a large topic to look at because it spans a huge number of eras, but it's important to note that with the myriad of different faction fights that went on around Ireland, yes, we have the likes of the ones in Dublin where you had the butchers who had knives, but it's important to note that these two groups, the weavers and the butchers, were essentially guilds of full-time working men. And as a result, these guys had knives on them because it was essential for their day-to-day work, but the likes of many of the more rural faction fights that took place, many of these people were farmhands and farmers and day labourers, many of whom had no real excuse to have knives on them, so they didn't have knives on them, and as a result, they didn't want to get into trouble with the authorities should they be seen carrying one or should they be seen using one. So as a result, you really just don't have a prevalence of knives and knife usage in these scenarios. Now, did they happen? Of course. There were people using them, of course, but it wasn't as widespread as some people might think or some people might claim. There was very much this attitude attached to the use of knives, as it was kind of a ruffian and a criminal's tool. So as a result, you just don't see their prevalence like you would in other parts of the world. So again, this video touches on a lot of different topics and a lot of different interesting cultural points, and it's something that I wanted to bring up for quite a while because I think it is a very misinterpreted part of Irish history. If you guys are interested in this and in discussing these videos with me, or if there's any videos you guys would like to suggest, you can always leave a comment, or if you'd like to chat with me one-to-one, you can join my Patreon. I have a members Discord for those who wish to discuss these things with me or suggest videos, and you can join for little or as much as you would like. Any little support you can give, guys, can give the channel. Hugely appreciated. I have a few videos coming. The winter or the summer has been like winter. It's been one of our wettest summers on record. As a result, my videos have been a bit waylaid. I had planned a hike last weekend, but unfortunately a storm hit, so I was unable to do it. But like I said, I do have some fun stuff coming. Thank you all so much for the support. I really do appreciate it. Let me know what you thought about the video. Let me know what you think of the topic. And if you have any questions about it, do let me know in the comments down below. And if you haven't, please subscribe to the channel. It really does hugely help. Thank you all so much for watching. And I really do appreciate it. Slán.